I wanted to ask you, first of all, Jessica, how does it feel to still be talking about your granddad all this time later after he is
Goodness
Doctor Who?
me. Kind of strange, I suppose. Yes, it is strange. Because growing up with actors as members of the family, it just seemed sort of normal. But it was all my memories of my grandfather are muddled up with Doctor Who.
Right.
So, you know, it was my grandfather was Doctor Who. So, because I was 6 when it started, and I did used to spend quite a lot of time staying with my grandparents. I can't separate out the memories really. The memories are of him being Doctor Who and it being something that people talked about at school all the time. So they're just a jumble of memories. I can't necessarily remember that memory of him was at that point, and if you see what I mean, because it was all indistinguishable. Yes. My grandfather was a Time Lord.
Yeah. That must have given you some. That must have given you some great kudos at school, I guess, in the playground.
We were told not to talk about it to begin with. My parents said not to talk about it because they didn't want. I mean, we weren't the kind of kids who would have bragged anyway, but they didn't want us teased or anything like that. So to begin with, we didn't mention it. I don't know when it. I have no memory of when it came out. I remember the playground where there were knock knock who's there jokes. So I know it wasn't in the first year of it. So maybe it was after it had been going a little while that people found out. And I do know that, I mean, it was impossible to hide once my grandfather had opened the local fete because I can't really hide it. So people did know about it after a while. And that was fun. I mean, there were knock knock who's there jokes, and I remember being incredibly thrilled when someone asked for my autograph. But again, time-wise, I'm not quite sure whether I was 6 or 7 or 8 really at that point. And I'll have to look at the book, my own book, to remember when the fate was.
Right.
So, at some point it came out, and actually maybe it did come out quite quickly because we had the Dalek suits. I think it was probably the first Christmas. It's awful because I haven't read my own book for a long time, and I wrote it 17 years ago, and I don't really remember the dates very well.
It must have been 65, I think.
Was it 65?
63 was, December was when the first Dalek story's on the stage.
Yes.
So I imagine, actually maybe 64.
No, 64. It wasn't as late as 65. It was certainly not as late as, it might have been 64. But we got the Dalek suits before they were on sale. We got the prototype ones. So I do remember walking along the street. We lived in a sort of street of new houses, new 1960s houses, which was sort of an estate. In other words, it wasn't a main roadway. It was a loop roadway, just a residential area. And I do remember putting these Dalek suits on and walking down the street. And my mother tells me that we literally had kids coming out after us, following us, Pied Pipers. So obviously people did know about it. And I mean, kids all the time would go, exterminate, exterminate, exterminate in the playground. So my memories are all sort of jumbled up from that time.
So what was the Dalek suit like? I mean, what did it do about the...
Well, in fact, we've been asked to find the remnants for a special reason. But it had there aren't very many of them because the factory burnt down.
Ooh, sabotage.
And I happen to know that it was...
Yeah.
It was a blue plastic, like a blue plastic sheet with big dots on it, with, as far as I remember, a sort of metal. It was like a skirt, but with a sort of structure to keep it Dalek shaped.
Crinoline.
Sort of. And it had leather or fabric or whatever straps that went over your shoulder, so that the body bit was hanging on your shoulder. It was made of like pressed card. I mean, not cardboard, but pressed card. And it had a sort of, I don't know, a bit down here, and it had a plunger. I think that was the plunger. And then this hand, there was an exterminator, and there was a little battery.
So you put it's like two sleeves. You put your hands
No,
through
no,
one
no, they
and-
were just
and also
little,
the other.
this thing hung off your shoulders, and you operated the plunger just with a thing, I don't know. You didn't put hands in, you just, and then there was this little button which the light flashed,
Wow.
I think, for the exterminator. And you could just move them around with little handles on the inside.
Very exciting.
And then the head bit was made of a sort of firm mesh, which you could see through, and the visor bits were made of this pressed card, so it was
Wow.
quite light. And there was a eye bulb thing there. So,
Quite complex.
Yeah,
Really.
it
it was
sounds
quite,
actually quite,
that's my memory. I haven't looked at them for a very long time, but that was my memory of
You
them.
mean you don't go up there and secretly dress in them and go?
No, they were. But my brother, who was a year and a half younger than me, you couldn't see his feet at the bottom. So they were only little. I mean, he was 6. So, I mean, 7. He'd have been 5 and I'd have been 7 probably at that stage. And apparently you could just see my feet, but his feet you couldn't see. So we just, anyway, that's my memory of that. So, as I say, all my early memories of my grandfather are muddled up with that. He was my only
Right.
grandfather, so that's what grandfathers were like, really.
This is
You know.
your granddad.
My granddad,
Yeah.
yeah. And I saw more of him on television probably than I did in real life, because obviously when he was shooting Doctor Who, it was 48 weeks a year. I mean, unlike anything that you do now, it was every week, all year, apart from 4 weeks holiday or whatever. And he would be in London during that time because they'd be rehearsing during the day and then recording on Friday night. So that even if I did stay with my grandparents during that period, he would only be home at the weekend, and he would be quite quiet and whatever. So
Exhausted.
yeah, and looking at lines. And I looked at the schedule. I met Waris Hussain last week, and he has the original shooting script and everything. He's kept everything. And that first week was a 6-day week. They started rehearsing on the Sunday, and then they rehearsed and recorded and finished 9:45 on the Friday evening. So they were long weeks, you know, and you have your lines to learn, and
Long
it was
days.
long days, and it's a small core cast. So it's not like a soap nowadays where there are dozens of strands and families, and you get things like EastEnders which go on all through the year, but you've got loads and loads of different characters and storylines. This was one little group of people, one storyline. So it was actually, you know, quite a commitment quite exhausting. And if you're away from your family, I mean, television's always been long hours, but when you are literally the only people in it, pretty much.
And not very comfortable working conditions. I don't know if you ever told any, you wouldn't because you'd be little, but I mean, some of the rehearsal rooms.
I went to the studio. I mean, the funny thing is, normally as a child, everything seems huge because you're little.
Yeah.
But when I visited when it was Riverside Studios, so it was when the Menoptera were being made, and I'm sure you all know better than I do when the Menoptera episode was recorded.
65.
Okay, 65. So,
If I don't, somebody else will,
yeah.
trust me.
so I was probably, which month, 65?
I don't know,
Oh.
actually.
Okay, but whatever, I was 7 or 8. And I went to the studios, visiting when they were recording, and even though I was that little, I remember thinking, this is very little.
And that was much better than Lime Grove.
I was going
It
to
was
say this is big.
minute.
You know.
And because the main studio where they were recording had, you know, all the cameras and I remember going into the costume and makeup when my grandfather was having his makeup put on and all that. And the makeup lady put a bruise on my arm, which I thought was terribly exciting. And I probably bored everyone all day and saying, look, I got a bruise, I got a bruise. And then we went into the main studio. And I was told, you know, to not trip over. And there were cables everywhere and big old-fashioned cameras and actors and bits of Zarbi head and people with Menoptera with these huge blooming wings trying not to bash them.
And those old cameras were enormous, bigger than Daleks.
So, and I remember thinking how cramped and crowded it was. And I also remember being taken along a corridor and shown one other little studio room. And it was a tiny room, well, seemed little, with a mound of sand and a TARDIS, a baby TARDIS, a little TARDIS sitting on it, obviously for a cutaway shot. And I remember thinking, oh, is that all it is? And it was so small, so I didn't see the TARDIS set. I just saw a Menoptera set where there was, you know, lots of creatures and things. But I do remember that sense. So it must have been incredibly crammed for all of you working, because if it seemed little to a kid.
Yeah, you're right.
So,
and because with Carole Ann were at Lime Grove, which is notoriously like a shed.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did you find the same kind of impact on your personal life? Because obviously you had a young daughter, didn't you? And
yes, indeed.
with that gruelling schedule, was that...
And made much worse, because at the weekends I was being asked to do charity things.
Right.
You know, open fates, open shops, open envelopes, everything.
How quickly after the show had started did it become apparent to you when you started to get these offers that actually you had a hit, it was a hit TV show? Was it very soon? Was it after the Daleks?
Well, yes, no, nothing to do with the Daleks. No, I mean, actually within a week or so,
Right.
really. Oh, really, definitely. I mean, you know, almost immediately I could not go out and get a pint of milk or something without people stopping me, and as I say, people were immediately asking me to come and do this and do that and do whatever. I mean, it got so I never saw my family, so I took my family with me.
Yeah.
I mean, I have many photographs of my little 3-year-old sitting with me, signing things.
how lovely.
Yeah.
And I suppose today we're much more kind of literate about actors playing characters on television. Was there a sense in those days that they thought that you were Susan? So was it a surprise to them? Yeah, when you turned up with your daughter, it's like, oh, you're really 20.
Well, I was constantly parading her because I didn't want to be typecast as a young kid. And because people would treat me as a young kid, especially, I'm afraid, your grandfather. And I was frequently saying to the press, no, I have a child. This is my child. It didn't make any difference. They still treated me as a kid. They still do.
And how did you find that fame? Was that something? Had you gone into acting to find that fame, or was it
No.
So how did you find
Definitely
it?
not. No. I went into acting to act.
Right.
I love and still do. Love the work. Didn't so much like that side of it. It's obviously not as manic now, but I don't know what it's like for them, the cast, to do it now. I imagine it's just as bad, probably worse even.
It's quite common, I think, to get hundreds of people turning up when you're filming and stuff these days. So there's very much a sense of kind of big superstars, really.
Yes,
so,
I can imagine that.
And so do you find it quite impactful, I guess, quite intrusive?
Well, intrusive in as much as it did take up a lot of time.
Right.
I never minded people stopping and asking for autographs or saying, "Oh, you are, aren't you?"
Who?
If you want me to be, I will. But I never mind people coming up and having a chat with them. That's fine.
Right.
Not so good when it got frightening. Like one fate in particular, I'd sort of been delivered by helicopter, which was fine, good fun being in a helicopter, and looking down, seeing thousands of people, and as I got out, they surged ahead, and I think it was totally unexpected. I had no one there to protect me,
Of course.
no entourage like you have these days, you know. And it got so that they literally had to call out people to come and help me. And when they said they were going to call out people to come and help me, I imagined great big burly guys coming. And I think it was the local Cubs or something. It seemed very small. I thought, how are they going to help me? But they were pretty good. I mean, they did help. But I mean, it really felt as though people wanted to take chunks of me. I mean, I imagined people pulling my hair out or grabbing my clothes. I mean, it was quite frightening, very
It was
frightening.
like hysteria. It was like Beatlemania, I guess.
It was like being a pop star.
Right.
It was not nice.
Did your grandfather, I think he loved it, didn't he?
Well, I mean, he was at least used to it.
Right.
I mean, not in quite the same way, but he had been quite a successful actor in the 40s and had had a fan club at that point. And he was always someone who believed that, you know, you should take note of your public and not ignore them and whatever. He always thought that was part of the job. But being in films in the 40s and to a certain extent the 50s wasn't quite the same. And when he'd done, I mean, I don't think programmes like The Army Game had that kind of adulation. I mean, he was used to being recognised. But I think it's slightly different. The adulation maybe for what was perceived to be a young girl, a young woman, as you were, might be slightly different from the kind of adulation he would have got. Because certainly in Doctor Who, his character was a little bit, you know, he was a bit of a mystery, so perhaps people would have approached him in a slightly different way, whereas if you come across as young and actually vulnerable, the character's always screaming, you know, it's a slightly different feeling. So he would have been used to it, but, you know, my grandmother basically took charge of dealing with all that,
Right.
because
How lucky he was.
because of the time, it was a time element.
Yeah.
You know, he didn't have time to sit and reply to people and things like that because he was on set or learning lines or opening fates and things.
And presumably he must be getting lots of fan mail. Did you get lots of
Oh,
fan
yes,
mail?
yes.
So how did you cope with yours? Did you get to somebody
Doing it
else?
myself.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Gosh.
studiously sitting there.
And do you
Well, I've got
remember?
this.
Do you remember what do you remember the effect he had on children? Because I read interviews with him at the time. He said he felt like the Pied Piper. Or he felt like a cross between Father Christmas and.
Well, I didn't really see, don't forget, I didn't really see him at that time because he was away in London working. And I only saw him when I went and stayed with my grandparents during that time. If he was around when I was there during the Doctor Who years, he was having a quiet weekend. They lived in the country, in a cottage, not in a village, and that would have been completely private time. You know, there was no way he was going to go out and about. The only time I saw him in that circumstance was at the local fete, where, of course, there were loads of people. I mean, the picture on the front of my book is from there. It was just loads of people. And so I didn't actually see him at any other time at that period with other people around because he was away working. I mean, you know.
And what was it like for you seeing all those people turning out for your granddad? Was it...
Well, if that's what it didn't seem strange because it didn't seem strange because,
Right,
as I say, it was all
yeah.
jumbled up with. That was what my grandfather did.
Right.
And since all four of my grandparents were actors, it wasn't particularly strange thing.
It's kind of in the blood, isn't it?
Yeah,
So-
it was my father's father was quite a successful actor in his generation earlier. So it was sort of, I was brought up on theatrical anecdotes. But don't forget, I didn't live with them full time,
Right.
so it wasn't something I saw all the time. And anyway, he was in London, and I wasn't. I mean, I don't know how many fairs and fetes and things, and I was at school, so I certainly didn't get trundled round to them. You know, it wasn't like my life was following my grandfather round to these things, and I only went to the local fete. I mean, I did subsequently go and see the panto that he did, but apart from that, you know, I was a kid at school, so I wasn't living with them. I did spend time with them, but You know, I mean, it was, and I was aware of all the fan mail, because in fact my grandmother had kept everything. She, I don't know, did you go on writing to people a long time, or because my grandmother just carried on writing to people a lot of the time?
Writing to people? There wasn't time to write to
No,
people.
no, no, but afterwards, when you finished, how long did it go on for, the sort of...
The fan mail?
fan mail.
I'm still
Yes.
getting it.
Oh, I know. I reply to it. I still get stuff that I reply to. But, so you just carried on with correspondence going on
Yeah.
to people for ages
Yeah.
and ages, yeah.
When you'd finished Carole, and you're trying to do other things away from Doctor Who, do you remember when it became apparent that Doctor Who wasn't going to let you go? Do you remember there was a point when they thought, do you know what, this is going to be hanging around for a bit longer than I thought?
Yeah, well, actually, this applied certainly to potential film and TV roles, not
Right.
so much theatre. So I sunk myself in theatre. I mean, I literally, as soon as I left Doctor Who, the next week, I was in a theatre play, and it was marvellous. It was so refreshing because I could do anything and everything in the theatre. And they were happy to have me, because with the theatre, it's all bums on seats.
Yeah.
You know, and if you've got any kind of a name in television or film, they're terribly happy to have you and put you up there and say, from whatever,
Yeah.
you know. So I got some wonderful parts in the theatre.
What did you do? What was the first thing
Oh,
you did?
Private Lives,
Wonderful.
Inadmissible Evidence, Pride and Prejudice.
Oh, lovely.
You know, just some wonderful. I've always wanted to be a character actress.
Right.
Never wanted to be a big starry actress. Doing lots and lots of wonderful different parts. You know, immersing myself in lots of different characters and musicals, of course. Did quite a few musicals, and it was just wonderful.
Was it frustrating to be, constantly referencing Doctor Who, or people not opening
Yes.
their doors because it was? Did you feel resentful towards the show?
Yes, I'm afraid I did.
I bet,
yes.
I can imagine.
And in the beginning, in fact, for quite a long time, I wouldn't do any conventions
Right.
or any interviews or anything pertaining to Doctor Who because, give me a break.
Yeah.
When does this end? I'm an actress, I'm a working actress, hopefully, who goes on doing lots of other things. And the thing is, in this country, I don't think it applies so much in America. What do you think, Jessica? But certainly in this country, you get put in a little box and you have to kick and fight and scream to get out of that box. I did get offered quite a few other television roles and film roles, which were all like Susan.
In the same mould.
Or if not Susan, at least scatty teenage kids, And no matter how much I held up my daughter and did all sorts of things to show people that I was a grown-up lady and could do other things, I was still typecast in this kind of character.
Oh, yes, it happens all the time still.
But not so much in America, I think.
Maybe not.
And I think maybe this today, if you make it in the show, then you're a star that can be pushed into other TV shows to bring
Well,
an
they're very
audience
clever
and-
nowadays, aren't they? Because they do other work while they're actually in the show, I notice. You see them in all sorts of other things.
Yeah,
Very clever.
Matt Smith managed to get
Yeah,
time out.
I imagine
But they
it's in the
don't shoot
contract.
48 weeks a year
No,
now.
that's
you
true. We
wouldn't-
couldn't have done anything
You didn't
else.
do
No.
that.
No.
And in fact, that's why Bill couldn't do the movie.
With Peter Cushing, the Dalek
Yeah.
movies, yeah.
Because they wouldn't release him mad. They wouldn't release him from the TV contract to go and do the feature film, which seems completely barking mad nowadays. But anyway,
I think the BBC was quite insular at the time, wasn't it? It didn't strike me as having much of a...
Nobody else can have it.
so so it would have been impossible for anyone to have done anything else without leaving. So.
Carole, what were your first impressions? Because had you seen Bill, obviously, his films and other
Oh,
work?
yes, yes.
What were your first impressions of him and your kind of first meeting? when you was
Oh,
young
love at
Jackie?
first sight.
Was it?
Yes, yes, I loved him. We got on terribly well, your grandfather and I. Our grandfather. No, it's funny because he did have a reputation, even then, that he wasn't an easy man to work with. Did you know that?
Well, oh yes, I'm very aware of it. Yeah, that's partly why I wrote the book.
Tread carefully here.
No, it's partly why I wrote the book, because
Yeah.
the book does explain that he'd had a hard life,
Yeah.
and a difficult time, and there were lots of insecurities from his childhood, which can make someone not the easiest of people. Perhaps. Oh yes, no, I'm very aware of that. My mother found him very difficult.
Ah, okay. Well, I didn't. No, I don't think he saw me as a threat.
But I think you said before that he often confused you for his real granddaughter and would be
Well,
quite...
I don't think he would have confused
He was only little.
But could be quite,
Yes.
quite authoritarian.
He was
with
very
you or-
grand paternalistic
Right.
towards me. And I think very often forgot that I wasn't actually a 15-year-old. And no matter how hard I tried. And he did try to control me. Was he a controlling sort of man anyway? 'Cause-
Yes, I mean, my mother had quite a difficult relationship with him, but you know, it's part, she was born when he was very young. She was away at school a lot of the time. He was away as an actor. I mean, you know, he possibly saw more of her than some men did in those days, because as an actor he had an irregular sort of lifestyle. He was always someone who was authoritarian, but yet had a really good sense of humour.
Yes.
She said,
Yes.
you know, he would just make them laugh. He would do such silly things and do pranks and make, you know, tell funny stories. So it was a real mixture of authoritarianism
Yeah.
and jokiness.
Yeah.
And
And that's how I found him when I was working with him.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's been quite nice because for years, before the age of the internet, I think the information Doctor Who fans had about him was bracketing him as this difficult, cranky, you know, like grouchy. But I think it's more coming to light, especially with your book, reappraising these stories about him, how he used to be. And certainly talking to people in panels like this, you get a sense of him being very warm, quite avuncular. If he was being crotchety, it's because he was a leading man, a professional leading man, who was, you know, cared about the show he was in and
Absolutely,
tried
yes.
to. Did that
Yes.
be...
Definitely.
Yeah.
a lot of people who are real perfectionists are quite difficult to work with. I won't name names, but there are some
Oh, go
people
on.
I know of who are, you know, not easy people to work with. Because they want everything, they take everything terribly seriously. And I think he was a real, and it sounds like he was a method actor before method acting had been invented. And because he was a character actor, he loved to completely immerse himself in a character. And that often takes actors over. It can take actors over if the part they're playing. And so when I know from what my mother told me that when he played the sergeant in The Way Ahead, originally, he went off and, because his own time in the army hadn't been very good, he was actually a very sensitive man. Probably a lot of the bluster was covering up his sensitivities and his insecurities, and he hadn't coped with the army during the war. He became allergic to the khaki dye, so he was, you know, they just wore this rough serge, whatever it's called, close to
Hessian
this.
sack or something, almost.
You know, rough wool next to your skin. And he became allergic to that, and he actually had a nervous breakdown. He simply wasn't the kind of person who could cope with army life or that whole idea. And so he actually was invalided out, having started the training, but not seeing active service. And my mother said he was a complete wreck after being in the army for a short while. And so although he'd done that training, when he went to play the sergeant in The Way Ahead, he actually went to sergeant training school, I don't know what you call it, but he went to where they trained, and he was allowed to stay with them, work with them, see how, and then actually sort of pretend to be a sergeant for a session or whatever, so that he actually did all that research before going to play the part. So it was very realistic. And I know that when he played in certain there were films where he played either crooks or policemen and things like that. Crooks, mostly crooks. He went, and the police allowed him to go. I can't really remember the details, but there was sort of like a black museum or something, a museum that the police had of.
Oh yes, it's in Scotland Yard.
Where they have the koshes and guns and God knows what. And I know he went there just to look at the kind of things, and he talked to the policeman about how the people behaved and all that kind of thing. So he was someone who totally immersed himself in a character in the way that certain people are known to do nowadays. And that was his way of, he found the character in that way. So I think that when he did do a role, and he quite often played edgy or crooked or whatever, difficult characters. He played a lot of comedy when he was younger, but later on, so I think that that kind of character would slightly take him over when he was not actually on stage, as it were. So, there was a certain amount of that. I can't remember what the original comment was. I'm kind of lost in the storyline then. But I think, so he would, there was a bit of a blurring of the edges with the role, which is why he took it so seriously about the TARDIS, why he had to make that his reality. It was, as lots of people have said, one of the reasons it was so successful was because all these were really good actors who took it very seriously. It wasn't seen as a kid's show, let's have a bit of fun. It was serious actors treating the reality of a fantasy world. They treated a fantasy world as a reality, and they made it real for them, which is why it was done with such conviction, even if the walls were wobbly and the things, the monsters looked like, bubble wrap.
Yeah.
They actually took it seriously in the way that actors nowadays with green screen and blue screen and things have to be frightened of a boom or a ping pong ball or nothing, or a spot of light. You have to take it seriously, just as in the, all these big monster epics wouldn't work now if the actors didn't completely believe that the alien is going to get them. It's actually, it's a skill to do that. So they did take it as seriously as filming Alien or whatever, and it had to be a reality for them. Even though the programme was, each bit was filmed only in 1 week, whereas you'd get weeks and weeks and weeks on a big horror movie or something now. So it was a reality for them, and if he was sometimes crotchety, sometimes it was because he just became Doctor Who.
Did you find, because we talked about him, needing to have a control. When you left the show, I think you said before that, he was quite taken aback that you wanted to leave.
He was actually very upset. Yes, he didn't like the idea at all. And he sent me a lovely letter, actually, saying, was I absolutely sure this is what I wanted to do, as he didn't think it was a very good move for me to leave, and, what were they going to do without me, that sort of thing. It was a very sweet letter. I've got it at home somewhere. Yes, he didn't like change very much, did he?
Lots of insecure people hate change.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the daft thing about an actor's life. They're constantly changing their place of work, the people they work with. Everything moves on all the time. So for someone who is basically quite insecure, it's
feeding that
insecurity.
And we just, the four of us had established such a nice dynamic. We each trusted the other. And that's terribly important, especially when you're working at that pace. You've got to be able to trust what the other person's doing. And we all did. We all understood the ethos of the programme. And I think he was worried that, other people coming in perhaps would not take it as seriously as we did. I'm sure a lot of people did think of it as a kid's show and a giggle, we had giggles, we had giggles in rehearsals. Yeah. On the first day, the first reading of the script every week, we had hysterics and got it out of our system. And one or two times when we were playing about with Daleks and various other monsters and things, we'd send it up a bit. But then after that, you get that out of your system, but then you knuckle down and you do it as seriously as you possibly can. And I think he was terribly worried that new people coming would not do that.
I think he struggled when Verity left, didn't he? And
again, the security of the people he knew. And certainly having interviewed a few people when I read, it was a long time ago, but at least one person I spoke to said yeah, he wasn't very easy to get on with. And that person, can't remember who it was now, said, probably because I was joking around too much. I didn't take it very seriously.
I can see that happening,
Whereas the people who took it really seriously that I interviewed, he got on, you know, it was as Maurice was saying to me, it was about respect with each other. You know, if you respected, that they all respected each other and thought they were good, and I mean, I'm an agent now, and I certainly know that I've had clients in a long-running series where you don't know where the characters are going. You don't know until you get your script. You have no idea. And I know that I had a client in something, and this client phoned me up in complete panic because the script, the storyline, completely took her away from the character that she'd created for herself. And she said, but that's not me. That's not how I saw myself. That's not how I've been playing it.
You do wonder sometimes if the scriptwriter's actually seen any of the previous ones, or the director, whoever's responsible.
And she became terribly insecure because everything that she'd been using to play her character had been swept away
The rug's been
by
pulled.
a new producer and a new scriptwriter and a new whatever, completely changing her character. And actors have to create. They create a character in their heads. They have it's believable to them. They, you know, put that character on when they go and play it. And if someone suddenly gives you something so different about it, then it can be, you know, a blow. And I think there's always that fear when the people change, when producers change or writers change, that somehow they're going to take that character away from you. And you own that character in that you've created it and all that kind of thing. And so I think there's a lot of insecurity comes from that.
Right.
In that you don't, in a long-running show, know where they're going to take you, who they're going to introduce. You know, oh, here's a character I was married to 100 years, you know, 200 years ago. You know, gosh, that's transformed my. How do I get that into my head? So I think there's some actors cope with it better than others,
Right.
but you know, someone as insecure as him
Find it quite difficult.
found it quite difficult. But I mean, as I say, it happens nowadays when actors feel that they know the character better than a writer who's only just come into it.